Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Melanie. I'm a professor at Stanford, and it's great to be here and hopefully get the chance to chat to lots of you during the day today about your research and about urban. So I'm going to talk about, present our new forthcoming handbook chapter, which is on urban economics in low and middle income countries. Just before I get started, how many folks are doing work that would be kind of in this realm, low and middle income countries? Okay, awesome. Okay, so I think this handbook chapter is probably something that we've written it for two audiences. One audience is folks like you, urban economists, who have a lot of skills, techniques, models, understanding of how really complicated GE relationships work. However, in many contexts, in particular in cases where formal markets might be missing, there's a lot of informality, there's some challenges with mapping our standard urban economics framework directly to, I don't know, understanding house prices in Manila in this context. So the first goal of this handbook chapter is for urban economists to get a sense of what are some of the basic facts that development economists know. And then there's, I think, a really exciting set of opportunities about how do we integrate some of those facts into our frameworks so that we can do work that's going to be more targeted. The second audience for this chapter, which is probably not most of you, is the development economists. And so development economists are usually very focused on causal inference, randomizing things. Is anyone doing an RCT at the moment in urban? Okay, so it's often quite hard to do RCTs in urban just because of the types of questions that we look at, the sort of settings we have, not impossible. And development economists tend to want to really focus on nailing causal inference. So things like spillovers, general equilibrium effects, all these sorts of stuff, they are problems rather than opportunities. And so as a result, and sort of also historically, a lot of the work in development economics tries to find really small isolated villages where there's minimal spillovers so that you can really understand the causal effect of your agricultural training program. So that's great. And over time, an increasing amount of the world's poor are living in urban areas. And so that is something that a lot of development economists don't have the right framework or just ways to think about. How do we even understand spillovers? How do we think about those? How do we even design our experiments? How do we sort of bring together those two sides? So this handbook chapter was our attempt to try and bridge that gap. And what I actually think is the people who are going to be the best place to bridge the gap are students who are going to be working. You're right at the forefront of the doing work, doing exciting work. You probably have classmates. If you yourself are an urban economist, you might have classmates that are development economists. Hopefully this might give you some ideas to go and try and find research partnerships or talk to classmates to see if you can do something, because I think there's a lot of really exciting work and very few people who are right at this intersection. And so it's a perfect kind of set of opportunities for grad students who are learning and looking for ideas to work on. So that's the goal today. For folks who are a little more familiar with the development economics side, this might be sort of a little, some of the facts will be more straightforward. For folks who are urban economists, please ask lots of questions. And then I sort of want to talk through how we set up the handbook. And at the end, we have sort of 3 or 4 areas where we think there would be particularly high returns for folks who are looking for research opportunities. And I think this would be exactly the thing that would be an excellent sort of set of ideas to find somebody who is doing field work in your program, one of your friends. Think about if there's some really exciting ways that you can collaborate. Okay. So why do we think about poverty, global poverty, switching from the traditionally rural areas to urban areas? Right now, about 60% of the world's poor are living in agricultural rural areas. So that's been historically the focus of a lot of development economics. We want to understand policies, market failures, et cetera, that are relevant to where folks are living. However, urbanization is increasing, and the part that it's increasing the most quickly is in the low-income world. Actually, that's another reason for urban economists to be interested in low and middle-income countries. countries like the US are pretty much urbanized. Where is all of the action happening? The cities that are growing 10%, 15% per year, those are all happening outside the US. And so if you're interested in lots of these questions about dramatic change, this is sort of the areas where you should be looking. Okay, so this figure here is showing the share of population that's living in an urban area just over time. If we look at the red line, the Americas, you can see that there was sort of a little bit of urbanization during the 50s, 60s, 70s, but we have kind of stabilized at a close to 80% urbanization in the Americas. If you look at Asia, you can see, again, Asia had dramatic urbanization. It's catching up at around 45%. And you can see here in Africa, both level of urbanization is much lower, and it's the place where urbanization is now happening really quickly. One sort of interesting thing to flag, I won't talk about it too much here, but there's actually quite a lot of sensitivity to how urban a place is, depending on what data you use. So these are using the definition that the UN uses, which allows each country's statistical office to define what urbanization means. So I think in the US, it's something like having 5,000 people in a location. Other countries define urbanization based on density, amount of agricultural work, or many other sorts of minimum standards, 20,000 people, more than that. And so what that means is that when you look across countries, this urbanization measure is measuring something different in every place. So if you switch that over to density-based measures, you can actually often get quite interesting different patterns of urbanization. So I think this question of, and that sort of makes sense. A lot of low-income countries are very dense on average. And so if we're using a threshold of density, this picture actually looks quite dramatically different, where most of the low-income world is on average as dense as the US at the moment. There's just much more in the tails. So I think that's even a really interesting first sort of comment here. Even the sort of simple fact about, is the world urbanizing? Has it already urbanized? Where is urbanization happening the most? Like, there's just a lot of issues that we are really fundamental that we still need to work through. If you're interested in that, you can check our handbook chapter at the end. We have a big discussion of that. Okay, so within that, if you're a development economist, what are you looking at? You're thinking about understanding how to increase income, especially for folks who are living with very few resources. And this is sort of the standard urban economics challenge, right? Why would you have the coexistence of something like Jakarta with something like rural Java and Indonesia? These are sort of 2 to 3 hours apart. Okay, average incomes, average time that people spend, average way that people are living are just dramatically different in these frameworks. So when we look at these pictures, what are sort of the standard explanations from the urban side? You know, why is it that we would have something like this, Jakarta, something like this, rural Java? You can see folks working in the paddy fields. What would be the explanations for, some of the explanations for these differences? Mm-hmm. Sorry? Agglomeration, okay. So there is that. But then, you know, okay, so agglomeration might explain why Jakarta has managed to grow more. You know, why is the person still staying, living, working in the fields if they have this option to move 2 hours away and earn presumably much more money? Yeah, so agglomeration could be part of it, and we could understand, you know, what are the processes of agglomeration, especially in different lower income cities. What else might be going on that we have the coexistence? This farmer here could just pack up, get on a bus 2 hours later, be living a different life. What is it that we understand about how they make their choices about where to live and where to stay? There's lots of things, right? Yeah.
Movement frictions.
Okay, movement frictions. So what would be the argument with movement frictions?
Especially in this kind of setting, there might just not be, say, even something as basic as a road that easily transports.
Yeah, so it might be that there are migration frictions. So it might be that there's no infrastructure. You know, you would like to catch the bus, there's no bus. How do you get there? It might be some things like there is a bus, but you have to pay some amount of money. Maybe it's a day's worth of work. It's hard for folks to save money. There's credit constraints, there's frictions. People don't have the money. They could also be related to that, maybe issues of risk. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that research, but is it the case that people are just worried? They might have the money, but they're really uncertain about what might happen. And so part of the friction is related also to things like lack of insurance or lack of certainty if they go and don't work out. What are some other just basic urban 101?
Preferences. Nice to hang out with your friends.
Preferences, okay. Yeah, so preferences, so that could be on two sides, right? It could be on sort of the, well, on the amenity side, and then maybe preferences or like heterogeneity on the productivity side. Yep, so we could think about that. We normally stick in this error term, and we would interpret that the people who have a really high draw for this place might just have preferences for living there versus here. And then you say something else really interesting, which is to hang out with your friends and family. So that is also something that there's lots of work, like informal networks, social networks. That's something that's super interesting, but it's really hard, and I haven't seen incorporated very well into urban. But this is this idea that people might say there's no way to get credit cards, there's no formal banking, you need to rely on your family for financial help. And so therefore you have incentives to keep that group closed, keep that group tight. If people start migrating away, then on one hand, you might bring in more resources for your family or your extended village. On the other hand, people may have incentives to sort of deviate and be outside the group. That might break down the group insurance. So that's sort of an interesting set of things. A couple more? Prices? Okay, so what would be the argument there?
Like very standard Rosa Roback, if the wages are higher, the land prices would rise to compensate for that, you'd be different between the two.
Awesome, yeah, so maybe it looks like nominal wages are high here. Once we take into account cost of living, maybe the cost of living in real terms is not actually as different as this and this. Okay, any one or two more? Yep.
Yeah, maybe comparative advantage in farming.
Okay, comparative advantage in farming. Yeah, so that's like the other side of this heterogeneity with the idiosyncratic preferences. It can be in there. You can often write our sort of IID shock, and you can interpret that as either preferences or you can interpret that as productivity. One interpretation of the productivity would be that the people who stay in farming have particularly high comparative advantage. That's obviously going to depend on whether or not comparative advantage and absolute advantage are going in the same direction or not, but you could think a little bit about that. And I think there's some like interesting work. We had sort of a small study in Indonesia where we were testing that by offering migration subsidies and varying the amount of migration subsidies. So do we have people who get a low subsidy, people who get a high subsidy? The argument would be that if you were less good at migrating, if you had lower returns, you might only migrate at the high subsidy, not the low subsidy. So we did sort of the double blind randomization where we had people opt in, migrate with high subsidy, migrate with low subsidy. And then half of the low people get surprised with the high so that you end up having ex post balance. And then you can look a little bit about that. Yeah, maybe one more and then we can keep going. Yeah.
Household decision making.
Household decision making. Yeah. So do you have some thoughts about that?
Well, in a lot of cases, I'm going to hate to say this, but the man of the house goes to the city and works, leaves some of the family members behind working in the fields, and kind of commutes back and forth. May go for months at a time, and then kind of send remittances back to the family.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's really interesting. That happens, I think, in lots of contexts. Lots of migrants coming to the US. Often that's a split household decision. In many cases, or often not always, sometimes the migration is very gendered. So if you think about, for example, migration of domestic workers from places like the Philippines to the Middle East, that tends to be mostly women. Nurses coming to the US, that's mostly women who leave their families at home. If you think about men who might be coming to work in construction or gardening, that might be, or in lots of this setting, men who might be coming to work. So that's really interesting. I think that's also challenging because what would we need to measure that properly? We'd need to have data on both halves of the migration couple. We'd need to understand what's going on. You could just sort of imagine that a lot of administrative data, especially in places that are data sparse, and it's going to be really hard to track that. You probably can track things like that if you're in countries that have really good administrative data, but it might be really, really important as well. Okay. So all of those things are really interesting. Some of those are going to be specific to low and middle income countries. Some of those are things that might be relevant even for thinking about location decisions in the US. And I think what the question is like, what would be the right framework that we would want to try and start understanding those issues? And then how do we get some sense of what data might be available, how we could think about getting causal identification? Okay, Okay, so I'm going to go through motivation to study cities and space in low-income countries. Basic spatial framework, I think that will be pretty straightforward, but let me just show you how I at least teach it when I teach it in my class. It, I think, helps a little bit to see some ideas. And then 3 and 4 is sort of where we want to think about this merging for urban and development. So what are the just on the ground basic facts that every development person would know? And then as urban economists, how would you think about how to start integrating those facts into your framework and your models? Okay. Cool. Okay, so in general, these are not going to be causal statements, but what do we know? In general, as countries are wealthier, they tend to have a larger share of their population living in urban areas. So you can think about the US up there, you can think about Mexico, Tanzania, this sort of cross-sectional relationship, not necessarily causal, but this cross-sectional relationship seems to hold. And so sort of at the macro level, as we think about urbanization, we may also be thinking about things like structural transformation and, you know, is this a step along the way to kind of getting richer? Is this causing countries to get richer? Urban economists would have things to say about those as well. Not surprisingly, as a country gets richer, you also see, or as more people live in urban areas, you also see a smaller share of the population primarily working in agriculture. Okay, so this is important. If you have, for example, really high share on average in the country living in urban areas, you have very few in ag. That sort of pattern holds. So it's not always the case that people don't do any ag if they're living in urban areas. There's still sort of small plots. And if you look at time use data and you look at household survey data, households are usually quite diversified. But in general, there's this pattern of structural transformation. Why might that be important? If we're thinking again about urban and we're thinking about trying to model demand for different types of products, we can think about what the trade folks do with, you know, there might be kind of roles there for different productivity in different sectors. Do people carry their productivity from one sector to another? How do we sort of think about that decision? Okay, and then I think this is also pretty compelling. So if we think about, for example, Ethiopia has a per capita GDP and purchasing power parity of $2,400 a year. Okay, everywhere in the world there are spatial gaps and there potentially are frictions or preferences. But when your level of income is so low, for example, $2,400, if you could increase income by 10, 15%, that's going to be something that has dramatic welfare effects, even more than sort of narrowing gaps when folks in general are further along their indifference curve. So what do we often see? We see that this is a sort of picture from the Casale handbook. This one is showing sort of a combination of what I looked at before. What share of the population is working not in agriculture, okay? And then what is a measure of productivity across sectors? And the sort of striking fact is that countries that are having a very small share of non-agriculture, so those are highly agricultural countries that we just saw tend to be poor, end up having very big sectoral differences between ag and non-ag. So for example, NPL, that's Nepal. Okay, what's going on in Nepal? Nepal has a really highly productive tourism sector, but most of the population are living in subsistence farming. So within sector, there's a massive income productivity gap that translates into a big income gap. But it's not just countries that are as stark as Nepal, although Nepal, I think, is an outlier because of the tourism. You can sort of see this pattern sort of across the board. So if we're thinking about global welfare, if we're thinking about differences like that, the estimates in the Casale handbook suggest that we could get about 90% of the way of resolving cross-country GDP gaps if we resolve the within-country GDP gap. Okay, so that is sort of striking. What might be the most effective way to reduce global poverty? Let's say the political economy constraints that we have mean that we couldn't have migration across borders. If we could facilitate or somehow think about if this is a mismatch, facilitating internal optimal allocation of people within a country, that would be enough in the aggregate to get most of the way towards resolving GDP differences across countries. Okay. Of course, once you start thinking about movements of people across international borders, that argument only gets more compelling, although, as we're all living through, there's obviously very big political economy challenges of moving people across borders. Most countries allow free movement, not every country, of people within their borders. Okay. So I think this is a really compelling reason for the development economists to be interested in studying urban and issues across space. Also, just thinking about, what is going to be the payoff, what's the returns? These are the big, big questions. Okay. And if we look across, this is just having some household survey data. This table is a little small, but let me just read you. What it's looking at is a bunch of different amenities, and it's showing that quality of life tends to be better in urban areas than rural areas. This is coming back to this idea that on average, urban areas is a wage premium. But if we look, for example, the first row, say percent with finished floors. So are you living in a house that doesn't just have dirt on the floor? If you look in urban, for example, urban India, 70% of the population has finished floors. Nigeria, 88% of the urban population has finished floors. If you look in the rural areas, it's about 2/3 to half of that. 40% of rural Indians are living in housing that has finished floors, 60% of rural Nigerians. If you look at things like owning a television, in India, 87% of urban households own a television. 70% of urban Nigerian households have a television. If you look in rural areas, it's 50%, 30%. Okay. These two are thinking about under 5 mortality. So what's the rate of mortality for young children? In India and Nigeria, it's sort of 36, 86 in the urban areas. It's about double that in rural areas. And then if you think about BMI, so malnourishment, again, malnourishment rates are twice as high in rural areas. So this is also interesting because if we think back and look at the historical patterns in the US, sometimes it was the case that urban areas were dirty and unclean and disease was higher than in rural areas. What we look at here is a lot of these outcomes are still showing that even though people are both earning more money, but there's not a sort of clear negative amenity of being in the city, which would be one of the other compensating differentials that most urban economists would think. Okay. And then this is sort of one of the first RCTs that was trying to think, obviously, I think we talked a little bit about comparative advantage. Is it the case that we see people earning more in urban areas than rural areas? Is it just selection based on comparative absolute advantage? So this RCT was sort of one of the first RCTs that tried to address that. It's kind of a really interesting result. I think it kind of ties in quite a lot of these questions we started thinking about. So in lots of parts of the world, when you're earning money in agriculture, there's a seasonality of when you're going to have income, when you're not. So that's another wrinkle. If you're looking at data that might be collected on average at one time of the year, people can have really big changes within the year. So during the off season, basically you've planted your crops, you're waiting for them to grow. You don't have any money because the crops haven't been harvested yet. Any spatial gap between urban and rural is only going to be magnified because rural income is even lower. So that would be seems like a particularly high return time to migrate, but often the seasonal migration is also not happening at a large degree. So this is an RCT in rural Bangladesh where the researchers gave enough money to catch the bus to go into the city, and then a couple of days of food to cover costs when you get there. And giving this small subsidy to migrate ended up generating 3 really interesting results. So the first set of results was that there was a dramatic increase in seasonal migration the year that the households got the subsidy. So migration went up 22%. Second interesting result, the next year, the subsidies went away, but migration still continued at about half the level as what it did when people were directly subsidized. And that migration effect lasted 4 years after the subsidy. And then the third was that you saw effects on household consumption, which is a good proxy for how well households are doing, both immediately and over the 4-year period. So it was the case that these were households who were induced to migrate. And actually, indeed, they were earning more when they were in the city because their consumption of their family members went up. Okay, so looking at that, does that generate any more wrinkles relative to what we just started talking about with pieces that might be missing? This sort of results, pieces that might be missing from our framework. So maybe talk to your table for a minute or two. I think the one that's most interesting is why did the migration continue? Once you took away the subsidy, obviously you pay someone to do something, it happens. That's sort of half of the economics RCTs, but it's interesting. What do we learn by the fact that you take away the subsidy, people keep migrating? So maybe chat to the people in your table for a minute or two, and then let's come back and talk about that, and then think about, is that something consistent with our framework or not consistent with our framework?
But actually, that is.
I can't get.
So like Medford, once you migrate,
We're not able to even go
Yeah, no, that's the thing.
I think they're probably
I think that's just like
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That makes sense. Yeah. Next. Okay, you guys good?
Right, you have your.
That's a difference. That's a treatment effect. So the treatment group relative to the control group. When you do randomized control trials, because you're randomized, then you can interpret that as net effect. But you're saying like, so it could be spillover effects, and if so, some of that would mean that the effects are a little bit smaller. So like both people migrated. So spillovers would be something that would be interesting, and like what would be the right RCT design to measure that? Like would this be able to let you answer about spillovers, or would it not be able to answer about spillovers? So spillovers are super interesting, but this simple design at the moment. So I didn't tell you how the RCT was, but would be hard, but they did some follow-up work to try and think about spillovers. Okay. Okay, so what did folks think about this? What seems to be some hypotheses about what's going on? And then again, we're starting this off, this is sort of, is it actually, if we think about the policy here, what would we need to know for whether or not, for example, the government should facilitate more migration? First of all, does it generate at least positive net returns in terms of income? We might then want to start thinking about things like, are people actually happier doing this? And for the understanding, are people happier doing that? We might want to understand a little bit about why weren't they doing that already? And then I think third, potentially if we're a policymaker, we may, which this study is not going to probably talk to, we may want to understand a little bit about the distributional effects. Did this extra income come at a cost to other types of people? How would we weigh those? But just thinking about these sets of results, I listened to a few groups talk about it, but what do we think about sort of understanding what seems to be like the most likely pattern here? And then does that make sense? Does it not make sense? Is that something that's in our model already?
I have a question. How many of the 9.2
that migrate here towards Amherst and Tier 4 were previously migrants, and how many are new migrants?
Interesting. So this is an RCT that was a randomized RCT at the village level. So what does that mean? And I think I had this conversation with another table as well. So the researchers went to a village. They recruited households who were eligible. For this particular study, you had to be having not very much land, and you had to have reported missing food the last lean season. So you're kind of in the bottom part of the income distribution. That is the sample, and there were 20 households recruited per village. Then what the researchers did is at the village level, they either offered all 20 households a subsidy, and there were a few other treatment arms. So one set of villages only got information about the returns. One set of villages got a grant, one set of villages got a loan. And then one set of villages were per control. So these are treatment effects, which means relative to the control village, what happened in the treatment villages. So I think your question is a little bit about like, is it the control group migrating? Is it the treatment group migrating? The treatment effect just tells you on average, what's the difference between the two groups. And then you can assume, because that everything was randomized, that on average, those are going to be, the groups ex ante are going to be comparable. If your question is a little bit about spillovers, like was some of this transmitted to other people in the village? This particular RCT design is not particularly well suited for spillovers. What you would want to probably do, well, what would you want to do if you wanted to measure spillovers in the village? What would be like a tweak you could do to the RCT design if you wanted to try and get at spillovers?
Give it to like 10 households. So see whether the remaining households.
Yeah, exactly. So if you wanted to get at spillovers, which I think is that they did actually a follow-up paper, the results are like a little confusing, but you can look it up if you want. But if you wanted to do spillovers explicitly, what you would want to also do is randomize intensity of treatment at the village level. So in this case, each village had 20 eligible households. All of them got offered 22% of them, 22% relative. The baseline migration rates were about 40 or 50%. So it's like 60% versus 40% go in the treatment than the control. So the gap is 22%. If you wanted to like look and think a little bit about spillovers and measure that, you would want to vary the intensity. So that would be another research design. And again, that's something where I think it's interesting thinking about how would you pin out externalities or how would you pin out spillovers. You could vary, maybe some villages have only half the people, some villages have 3/4 of the people. If you have either positive or negative spillovers, you should expect to see village level migration correlate with how many people you offered it. Yeah. So this is sort of the treatment effect. We can't say too much experimentally about what is going on there. It's a bundle, but in the paper, they do a little bit of non-experimental stuff. What they actually show is that the people who re-migrate are the people who had particularly good experiences when they got to the city. So the people in the upper tail of the distribution are the ones who go. The people who go try it out and don't have a very good experience don't end up going back again. That's non-experimental, but it sort of gets a little bit at the mechanism. Okay. So what was sort of the consensus about why a one-time subsidy can have such a persistent effect on migration? Yeah.
In the paper, the information treatment arm didn't have positive effects.
The information treatment arm didn't actually have any positive effects. So they actually, in the paper, they bundle the treatment arm, like information with the control. So they do kind of incentivize financial incentives, which is actually an interesting thing to think through as well. Why would you think that the loan should have the same effect as the just pure gift? And then they bundle together the pure treatment with the information, but the information is pretty crude. If you go to this city, you would earn blah, blah. So I think when I came past your table, you were talking about information, but a little bit more tailored.
Right, by getting this treat, so before you had some expected wage of the urban area and net your migration costs, and you know your wage in the rural area. And so before having this information, you might have a large variance of what your expected wage would be and a good knowledge about what the migration costs would be. So before having the information and the subsidy, you would think that your expected wage of staying in the rural area is higher than migrating. Then after you get information about what your wage would actually be at destination, and you know the migration costs, then you can flip into a scenario where the time to return to migrating is positive.
Yeah, and so this I think is a big part of the story. This is what the authors argue, and they're sort of arguing that a lot of the information is idiosyncratic. So just even if you know on average what the wage is, that doesn't tell you if you will be the sort of person that earns that wage. So for example, if you go to the city and you manage to make a contact and get employed, that might be a persistent contact that you have. You can go back and work for the same person. If you travel and you find it really hard to get a job, then you may not actually have that persistent asset that lets you go back again. So again, if we're thinking about things like information, there's lots and lots of information RCTs. In other settings, people have found giving more targeted information about returns can induce migration. Often it ends up inducing folks who are migrating somewhere already, and it induces them to go to a higher return place. So we had a student, Travis Basler, who has a really nice paper thinking about information on the real returns, both wages and prices. And then the second part of his paper actually looks at why doesn't that information flow back, and what incentives do the migrants have to kind of obfuscate that they don't have high returns, so that they don't have to give back as much money to the family. So it's kind of interesting to think through. Okay, so part of it could be that there's information. So once you go, that gives a persistent thing. They do a little bit of work in the paper, looking to see like if you had more friends that were migrated, did you migrate more yourself? They don't see any effects of that, which would be consistent with this idea that it needs to be like an experience good that you go and try it out. Okay. The one other piece that's a little bit of a wrinkle here is that this subsidy wasn't that much, less than a week of income. So it is the case that folks don't have a lot of income, but the returns are dramatic. And the amount to try it out is pretty small. So the one other puzzle that I think we can think about is what was stopping people from making the small investment and going, if they know that they need to go and learn about it in person, what stops people from going and learning about it in person when the investment to go and do that is, it's a little bit of money, but it's less than a week of earning. So I don't know if any group talked about that. So that kind of question is, why does this RCT have an effect? What is that constraint that means that people haven't already figured this out by themselves?
One thing is that there's a fixed cost,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they've invested in the fixed cost the first year, and then it's cheaper to go the next year because they've already invested in the fixed cost of migrating. The other is that they may get paid more the second year. We just go up with experience.
So those I think about, and both of those things are probably true. And even if there's a fixed cost, that still would have been on average for most households, they would have had a positive return if they had gone and experimented and see if they could have, if they're the sort of person who has the return of migrating. So what would have stopped them from experimenting in the first place?
They didn't have the money in the first place.
So that's true. I mean, people might not have that money, but it's not that much money. Like a week of income, I mean, it's some, but you would have to have really, really, so what would it mean to not have the money that you can't save up to get a return this high? You would have to have literally like a savings that in the paper, they sort of work out what the rate of return would have to be. It would have to be severely negative, like negative, I don't remember, 15% or something to justify why people couldn't save this money. So it is the case. Maybe it's hard that you can't save anything. We don't always think about negative, maybe there's zero return on saving. Like what actually is the mechanism that behavior is consistent with a negative return on saving such that people can't do it? It could be. But,
The fact that it's a group subsidy is important. Perhaps this gives something for folks to coordinate around, and the costs are lower if you will try it out with peers from your same town.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in the follow-up paper, that was what they were doing with this RCT design that we talked about where you vary the intensity. I think what the hypothesis was that if you're thinking about the standard general equilibrium effects inside the village, more people leave, wages should go up inside the village. Therefore, there should be that sort of general equilibrium effect going on. What they found in the RCT where they randomized, you give more people subsidies in the village, and more people who were unsubsidized actually start migrating, not fewer. So for example, 75% of the village gets subsidized, 25% not. If the only thing that happens is the subsidized people leave, then that should potentially increase wages in the village for those remaining 25%. Compare that to a village where 50% get subsidized, 50% not. So the unsubsidized people, you might think would be more likely to stay in the first case than the second case. And what they found in the follow-up RCT was that more people actually migrated when more of their friends were getting the subsidy, even if they themselves weren't subsidized, which is consistent with this. So I think the other thing that one other piece kind of comes back to the risk factor. So in the paper, because you would have to have a really massive negative, quite a large negative return on your savings to, why can't you save up to go and experiment on this? You could have a really large negative return on savings, possible. There's lots of pressure from families and friends to share resources. It might be the case that you do indeed have a negative return on savings. The other thing that they argue is that because households are so close to subsistence, experimenting and failing is very, very, very costly. Because if you go and you fail, it's not just on average you didn't do well. That might be enough to put you below subsistence level. Then that is a really, really expensive thing to do. So in this case, what's perhaps stopping you is that it's a combination. Even if you could save up the money to go and try and do it, you may not have the money to support you if you fail. And then that makes risk, like experimenting, really, really, really risky. So in the paper, that's sort of what they argue is going on, that people are so close to subsistence that this RCT ends up by giving assurance. And so you can go and try out, you can go and experiment, you get the downside risk covered. If you figure out that you're good at it, you're golden, you just keep going. If you figure out that you're not good at it, that's fine, you go back, nothing changes. And that's sort of how they square the circle. And then the only kind of wrinkle with that would be, why did the credit have the same effect as the cash? So people were as likely to migrate if you gave them a loan than if you gave them cash. And so if this is a story about having to pay back, it's a little tricky. What they do to sort of argue about that, which is probably plausible, the credit was given by an NGO. So they argue that they think there's probably limited liability. If you really go and you have a disaster, probably the NGO wouldn't actually require you to repay it. And so that's kind of doing, all you need is the downside risk covered, not the upside. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions about the set of results? Mm-hmm.
Did it lead to any permanent migration?
It led to very little permanent migration, partly because these are households who are primarily agricultural households. So they, I think it led to like 1 or 2 people permanently migrating, so just very, very few. And I think what happens, maybe preferences, these are households who are happy to live in rural areas. It's just that within the year, there is this fluctuation. And so they want to go out there.
What was the distance?
There were different cities that were, so people were randomized to different places. On average, people were traveling, I think, like 6 or 7 hours by bus. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't recall. Are these like primarily landowners, folks leasing land, or like working for a wage? So
these were, in general, in this sample, these were households who had to own very little. So there was an upper bound on how much land they could have to be eligible. So they're primarily, they could own it a little bit, but they're primarily landless laborers or people who have just a really small subsistence plot.
I wonder if just knowing that I'm being treated doesn't update my distribution of beliefs about the returns that I'm going to receive going to the city. I mean, I know that this program exists and I'm going to be treated. I know that. So maybe the researcher thinks this is going to work, and then I update my beliefs as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think this is coming into experimental design. So what would you want to do? Do you have thoughts of how you could think about it? If you're concerned about that, what you could do in your experiment to try and address it? Anyone have thoughts about this? The sort of experimenter effects, the fact that you come in and offer people something gives information in and of itself other than just the direct subsidy. Mm-hmm.
Vary the size of the subsidy, maybe both people are treated with the experiment effect. They did in terms of how much money they get.
Yeah, so you could think about something like that. You could think about keeping the information constant, maybe varying on the intensive margin the subsidy amount. You could also think about cases where this is an across village comparison, but you could think about randomizing within a village, and then presumably the control group in the village doesn't get the subsidy, but they learn about the program because the researchers are there walking around. And so maybe the information piece is there. But of course, you have to also think about the logistics of giving some people this opportunity inside a small village and other people not, that might be quite complicated for whoever's running the program. They may or may not want to do that. So you have to sort of design this and think a little bit about this. Okay, so all of this to say, I think if we were doing RCTs, this is a sort of, so many papers in urban have been written on urban wage premium. I think in low-income countries, this is one study that we can say, indeed, going to live in an urban area has a positive causal effect on your earnings. And then I think the process of what we learn on the side of this is lots of really interesting hypotheses. How much of this is about risk? How much of this is about information? You know, what other policy levers does that suggest that we might want to think about if we're trying to think about efficient allocation of people across space? Okay. So that I think is also, this is sort of one of, it's interesting talking about this paper. This is sort of one of the papers I think that's like one of the more prominent RCT. How many folks have seen this in classes, this paper? Okay, so this is like one of the more prominent RCTs in development. And then I think it's sort of seen as a really big success in terms of like the amounts, the returns that you get, 30% income, 30% increase in consumption. If you think about returns to one more year of education, those are around 7%. So, and it's really hard to give people one more year of education. Even things like building schools in Indonesia, the Progresa in Mexico, that ends up generating less than half a year usually. So you can do a whole lot of investment on getting kids to go to school more, building schools, subsidies, et cetera. Or you can maybe facilitate migration. Facilitating migration even within the same country might lead to orders of magnitude larger gains. So that just seems like a really compelling poverty alleviation policy. Okay, so let's keep going about a couple of other things that might be context specific, not just for low-income countries, but we can think about. This is looking at Accra. Demons, what it calls demons of density, right? Congestion, negative amenities. So this is sort of thinking about, this is a big trash heap, if you can see this. So what happens in terms of pollution? What happens in terms of sanitation when you have large, often unregulated cities? What do we think about with changing climate? How would that interact with urban areas? Often, if you think about the sorts of work that people are doing in urban areas, that might be less dependent than rural areas on things like weather. What does that mean in terms of where people are going to be living? What sort of resilience? What sort of policies need to be there for urbanized urban areas? And how do we think about that? Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go through, since I think this will be pretty much an overview, let me go through the basic spatial model. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll sort of talk about what are the pieces in the spatial model, and then how do those map back to some of the facts on the ground about development. And again, here, the goal is mostly to just set the stage and then think about all of the opportunities that might be there for research that ideally you all can go off and start thinking about, talking with each other, finding classmates who might be able to help you with the fieldwork. Okay, so basic spatial model. Okay, spatial equilibrium, that's what we want to understand. We want to think about not just what happens if we change a policy, but what are all the indirect effects? So we give people in one part of the country more money, or we could think about the migration example. We subsidize people to migrate. That's fine. We're doing this at a small scale. We probably don't think that there are too many GE effects. What happens if the government builds more roads and this kind of experiment starts happening more at scale? What are going to happen to the returns? What are going to happen to the distributional effects? How do we understand that? Okay. So our bread and butter spatial model is, I think, a really good workhorse tool. This is a nice natural starting point for analyzing what happened in urbanization. And I think this is something where this is bread and butter for urban economists, but this framework often is quite complicated for people who are not urban economists. And so I think one of the first things is, how do we communicate the framework and the benefits of the framework while acknowledging some of the really strong assumptions, what we need to do to take the model to data so that we can have buy-in from the other people in our profession. I don't know how many of you have presented your work, urban economics, in front of audiences that might be a little more skeptical about the modeling assumptions, but a lot of people find it quite a lot to digest. And so here I think it's good to just make sure we can understand what is really driving each of the pieces that we're assuming, and so that we can think about how do we make our work more compelling for when we're talking to a broader audience. And these are sorts of skills, if you're on the job market, you've got a really beautiful model, it's got so many exogenous shocks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have people ask, like, what does that map to in the real world? Or what is that? How do we understand or what do we interpret that? You know, what is your IID shock really mapping to? And you need to think through what is it mapping to? What isn't it mapping to? How do you communicate that so that you can sort of make sure that you understand your framework, but that you can explain it really well so that people can see that you understand what's doing. Even if they might not believe all your assumptions, you at least understand what you're assuming. Okay, and so, you know, for example, I was giving this talk last year in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire. If you're in any big city in the world, there's always lots of traffic. So I think every conversation starts around traffic. You know, there were like sort of big traffic. There's concerns about house prices. You know, what would be the right policy if you're in Côte d'Ivoire? You're building more roads. Are we expecting more urbanization? What would happen if there's more climate change? That's a product negative persistent shock in agriculture. How do we think about the dynamics in the city? What do we think about as the right policy response? Okay, so if we start with our Rosen-Roback model, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but just feel free to ask if you have any questions. Okay, wages, rents, amenities. Let's start with those. Let's assume no migration costs. And let's assume that if you're in location A, you have wages, you get an income, you pay rent, and you have some amenities. That's going to be common to people in location A. And then we have our friend, the idiosyncratic shock. The idiosyncratic shock is just something that's going to make people have different choices. So everyone is not choosing the same thing. Okay. Same thing for being in location B. Wages, rents, amenities, and then your shock for being in location B. Okay, so what does that look like? If we plot here, what is your realization of your shock for being in location B? What is your realization of your shock for being in location A? Each dot here is a person, right? So this particular person has pretty low B, pretty low A. That person at the top has pretty high idiosyncratic realization of B, pretty high idiosyncratic realization of A. Okay, if it's the case that the returns are common, what that means is that we can just draw the line where you migrate if you've got a relatively high realization of being an A relative to B, taking into account the common utility difference across the two locations. Okay, so what does that mean? It means everyone here is going to migrate to A, everyone here is going to migrate to B. And this is where you can see our interpretation of, is the idiosyncratic shock preferences? Is it productivity? At the moment, it doesn't really matter. You could be migrating because you just like it more. You could be migrating because you're earning more. But basically, the idiosyncratic shock is doing quite a lot because it's exactly telling us who is migrating and who isn't migrating. Okay. So here I'm using the notation from Moretti's handbook chapter. I just think it's quite nice just to set the stage. This is probably, again, all review, but I think for folks who've never seen these models before, it just helps to give a flavor of what's going on. So in Moretti's 2011 handbook chapter, he makes this assumption that the difference between your shock in B and your shock in A is uniformly distributed on some support. Okay, that's not going to be the general assumption we make, but I think it just helps here because it lets us get this in closed form. Okay, so you're migrating to A if your value of being an A is higher than your value of being in B. And you can write that in terms of this difference if you have a particularly different shock of valuation of being an A versus B relative to what on average everyone has. Okay. If we make this assumption about uniformity, we can write it as the probability that you're living in A. If A has got the same indirect utility as B, because the shocks are uniform, VA minus VB is 0. So half the people are going to be in A, half the people are going to be in B. Okay. Once we have the fact that there's going to be some variation of shocks across people, not half the people are going to, if it's the case that one place is still, like A is really great, some people are still going to live in B because they have a really high idiosyncratic shock for B. Okay. And so if you make this assumption, again, it's just to set the stage. what you can see is that the share of people who live in A is going to be a function of how much better A is than B, but it's going to be divided by S, which is the support of the distribution. Okay. And in particular, what that tells us is it gives us sort of a sense of where the heterogeneity in preferences is going to come in. So if it's the case that S is really large, is that going to mean that the A gets a positive productivity shock? Is there a larger or smaller migration response? And what's the economics for that?
People have very strong idiosyncratic preferences for either location on average, and they're not going to be very reactive to changes in the.
Exactly. Okay, so this is sort of like this simple framework is basically almost all of our economics, right? If it's the case that there's a lot of heterogeneity, the variance is really large across people in terms of how much they like one place versus another, the same size shock in one location is going to generate a smaller migration response because people are not going to value it the same way. And in this case, that's exactly parameterized by this S parameter, which is telling us like sort of the scope of the distribution. And our Frichet or our Gumbel, that's going to be the shape parameter, does the same thing. Okay, so this is the migration elasticity. Okay, the migration elasticity to a productivity shock. And sometimes people used to think about, which is the next bullet point, if you look at, for example, some of Steve Redding's papers, sometimes he talks about the elasticity there being the migration cost. It sort of acts like a cost. People are sort of sluggish and they're not responding because people have very high preferences. You can also think about a cost being something that might be bilateral. So if it's the case that, for example, you also have to pay tau to move between the locations, you can just put that in here. How many people live in A? How likely are you to live in A if you start in B? If tau is 0, then you get back the same formula. If there's a friction, then obviously you are less likely to move. This is the fixed cost. And conceptually, I think there's a difference between the elasticity and then the cost here. If you want to think about separating that out into, for example, origin destination, maybe everyone has the same elasticity, but your origin destination cost might depend on infrastructure. So that might be one reason to split it up. Okay. So I think this is kind of, I think I like this because what it's showing, on one hand, is very, very simple. On another hand, it is showing that whatever you assume about that idiosyncratic shock is driving quite a lot of your results. So I think it's good to think through what that maps to in the real world, because in my experience, this is sort of the piece. You're going to put a lot of effort into estimating this elasticity. And that's going to be the piece that people are going to be a little skeptical about if they don't believe your framework. Okay, so it's a really simple framework. You can explain it with just a picture. But the sort of underlying distribution and assumption you make is doing quite a lot of work. And so, for example, if we see that people are less responsive to a migration shock in the US than they are in Mexico, in this simple framework, we're going to put that all down to something that is a parameter in the underlying preference shock parameter distribution. Maybe that's not that satisfying. Maybe that's satisfying. Like that's not really telling us what's actually the reason that those things are different. It's just saying the elasticity is different. That's consistent with a different parameter in this distribution. So I think that's just the kind of point to sort of set. When we want to extend into 2 locations, then the same economics is there, but we don't make that assumption that, for example, there's a uniform distribution. We can choose either type 1 or type 2 extreme value distributions. Gumbel shocks or Frichet shocks, depending on what kind of frameworks you work. Gumbel is the log of the Frichet, so it doesn't really matter. And then you can see that, for example, in the Frichet, that theta is inversely related to the S that I was talking about. That becomes the migration elasticity. Okay. And so that is basically the framework. And then the only other thing we need to do is we need to just think a little bit about how to close the markets for wages, rents, and amenities. What are, again, the assumptions about how we close the market on those so that we can understand the GE responses. And that is sort of pretty standard and straightforward to do. We can think about, for example, a productivity shock on one location. Productivity goes up, wages go up, holding prices constant, people want to move in. Maybe we have an adjustment, therefore, through housing prices. Maybe we have an adjustment through endogenous amenities. Therefore, not everyone wants to move. Therefore, we look for a sort of fixed point of that system. And then you can see that, again, almost every model, I think, in economics can be just, it's always really compelling to have a really simple framework when you're presenting your job market paper. Just kind of strip it down to the absolute basics, and it means everyone's going to understand what's going on. That's what we're saying here. You know, we would have, for example, a labor market, a housing market, a productivity shock would increase labor demand. Therefore, it would increase the number of people who want to live there, which would increase housing demand, therefore increasing rents. Therefore, labor demand holding rents constant wouldn't shift out by as much, and that's how we would iterate and get our fixed point. Okay, so why don't we take a 5-minute break there, and then we're going to come back. We're going to look through each of those markets. What is different about low-income countries vis-a-vis what we might think of in the US? Okay, folks, hopefully everyone's got coffee. Okay. So before I keep going, basically that's the spatial model. We're going to go through now each of those markets, and I just want to flag a couple of the on-the-ground facts, and then talk a little bit at the end where we see gaps in the literature, which I think would be particularly productive for folks to start working on. Before I get going there, are there any questions or thoughts from what we went through so far? Mm-hmm.
That's just like a really large scale question, just about measurements. I mean, both like on the micro level, I'm really curious, you know, how people approach measuring consumption and wages when that's, I mean, challenging in agricultural settings, low numeracy settings. Also, just like at a macro level, like I know Nigeria just revised how they calculate GDP in their economy is like 30% larger than they thought. And so like, how do people approach all this in like a research context? Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think some folks were doing work in low-income countries, right? So what data are you using for?
I'm working on like it's RCT, like spillovers within a factory.
Okay, so spillovers in a factory. So you're collecting survey data yourself? Okay. Yeah, will be. So one of the answers is that you collect survey data yourself. So things like consumption and income, all of that stuff, people who have, you know, there's lots and lots of experience collecting that. Has anyone actually collected survey data yet? Mm-hmm.
The survey data, we use satellite images.
Satellite images. Okay, so satellite imaging is also that's a really kind of exciting one. And I think in the last part of the handbook chapter, we're trying to talk about like what are some of the data challenges. Adam's handbook chapter also talks a lot about new data and exciting. So the handbook of regional and urban economics is coming out sometime in the next few months. So take a look at that. It's got chapters. It's got a really nice set of chapters covering lots and lots of.
You guys are like an important part of it. You guys are like half of the intended audience.
Yeah, exactly. So things like satellite data, I think satellite data are wonderful. Phone data are wonderful because you can get that across space. You don't always have things like consumption, and you don't have everything, but you have some stuff. Has anyone collected their own survey data yet for their project? Mm-hmm. What are you collecting?
We developed an app.
Okay.
Basically collected the usage data at the end.
Okay. So for that, do you get like information on consumption and earnings? Like they're filling out surveys, or they're just getting them from?
Yeah, they're filling out surveys. So it was just an information app, right? Mm-hmm. And we were just looking at which kind of sites they kind of went to inside to kind of like trace back the information patterns, the search behavior there.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so data questions, I think a lot of the time you have to go on the ground and collect it. It can be really hard to do that. So we have a paper in Dar es Salaam. Claire, my co-author, is presenting it tomorrow in the Urban Summer Institute. And what we were just doing there is we were measuring, there was a rolling out of rapid transit in the city. And there's always a lot of questions about, you know, resorting, gentrification, urban neighborhood change when something comes in that's place-based. So in that project, what we were interested in looking at is, you know, what happens in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania when they get this new public transportation. And We went, before the BRT opened, we surveyed and we enrolled about 1,750 households. So we did that. We had GPS coordinates around the city. We went to each GPS coordinate. We knock on the door. We then enroll about 12 households at each GPS coordinate. And those became our sort of sample that we wanted to track. And then over the next 3 years, and for each household, we enrolled 1 male, 1 female. And over the next 3 years, what we wanted to do is we wanted to follow the man and the woman if they moved out of the house. And then we wanted to re-enroll whoever moved into the house if a new person moved in, so that we could track on the individual dimension as well as the house, like the physical structure dimension. And it was wild. There was a lot of, we had about 40% migration of individuals over 3 years. And that's not totally different. Migration rates in an urban area in the US are like 7 to 10% of renters. So you have people moving every year. It's really complicated to find people if you're in a city that's like 10 million people, because sometimes people have connections, but say you're a young man living by yourself in a house, you're renting and then you move, your neighbors may not have kept in touch with you. And so it's just a lot of effort, especially in urban areas, to track people over time. So it's, I think, one of, you can do that, but you really need a big research team, a big budget. Lots of countries actually don't even collect census data because it's expensive. They don't have the resources. It's hard. So, for example, in Tanzania, the way that they get the population counts is from satellite data. They assume, I think, 3.7 people per house. They have satellite counts of how many structures there are, and then they just multiply that. That's where the number comes from urban population. So that might be fine on average, but who knows if there are 3.7 people per house? What are we counting? So I think the measurement stuff is really, really hard and important. And then that is, I think, often one of the barriers for folks wanting to come in and do work in this space is, and that's why it would be really good to team up with a development classmate who is going to know how to do that. You have the model skills. I think that's probably, it's going to be something that you will need, or if you're going to go and collect data yourself, make sure you're talking to lots of people about how to kind of track people over time and things like that. Things like GDP and aggregate data like that. I think a lot, it's difficult. Even countries like Brazil, which produce like sub-state GDP, it's all imputed. So it's not, I don't know how accurate it really is. You get the numbers, but if you look at how they compute them, like it's taken from state averages, proportioned out. You might want to be a little thoughtful. I think those sorts of things, you might want to be a little thoughtful about where does it come. Just because you can download it from online doesn't mean it's actually representing something that's realistic. So I think that's like one of our big areas where, what are the exciting data avenues? I think satellite data, phone tracking data, how can you combine anything about individuals with some of those aggregates? Can you go and collect surveys? If so, what are the highest return ways of collecting your own data? Can you code up apps, things like that? There's lots of really exciting data. Nina has a paper where they did like Google Street View photos, for example. They were trying to understand how formal different neighborhoods were. And so Google Street View had most of the cities, but it doesn't have all the slum neighborhoods. So then you could go through and you could send enumerators to take photos of the stuff that wasn't on Google. So that would be a way to fill out the city. So I think people are being quite creative. Historical digitization. There's lots of kind of creative ways to do it, but the data is an issue. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I just have a question about the migration, like the state you just mentioned it. So like read these papers, they calibrate like it says over 1 because in gamma function, if it's lower than 1, it will go to the infinite. But without the migration course, the electricity always calibrate like lower than 1. I try to calibrate Japan or China migration electricity like 0.5 or 0.6. Like, is there any way to like avoid the makes the gamma function be infinite? If when you aggregate the welfare, you need the gamma function, right? Mm-hmm. One way is to use hat, but if I saw modeling level, how do I avoid this kind of situation? So you're asking about estimating the shape parameter and the Fréchet distribution, and whether or not that ends up being bigger than 1 or bigger than 2, which you need for the mean or the variance to be defined. Yeah. So you can estimate the migration elasticity. When I've estimated it's been bigger than 2, but I'm not sure. Maybe sometimes it's been smaller than. And then that's a little bit of a problem because
if it's smaller than 1, the mean isn't defined. If it's smaller than 2, the variance isn't defined. So like, again, coming back, like, have you got the right, does that economically make sense if you're getting an elasticity that's not consistent with a shock? So I think that you might want to think about, yeah, like what variation are you using? Is it compelling? What does it mean? Have you got the right model? I think it can't be the right model if you're getting a parameter that's not economically sensible. So what are you missing in your framework? Okay. Okay, so this is a really nice paper. It was in the AR last year. So I think this is like where I see urban and development folks having a big potential for collaboration. Okay, Ethiopia and Addis. Lots of governments are very open, to doing a lot of, there's a lot of innovation in terms of trialing out policies, randomizing things. So there's lots of quite high-level collaborations that are happening, partly because of all the work that JPAL has been doing. So for example, in Ethiopia, they want to understand if doing a workforce program, so giving folks income if they work for a certain number of days is a good idea. Okay, they want to do it in Addis. Addis is a big city. The development economist says, okay, no problem. Let me just randomize at the neighborhood level. I'll give treatment over here. I'll give control over here. We'll be able to track out what happens. However, if it's the case that you're randomizing one neighborhood here, you're giving them this workforce program, they drop out of the labor market. They used to be working downtown. They drop out of the labor market. What happens to wages downtown? Potentially goes up. What does that do? That violate our Sutpher assumption, right? Stable unit value, treatment value effect. What does that mean? That means like no spillovers. So if we want to compare treatment and control, that works if we don't have spillovers. If we have general equilibrium links, so giving people this workforce program in one neighborhood makes them change the wage for people who are in the control group because they're all working downtown, and indirectly the control group gets a higher wage because people in the treatment group have stopped working downtown. That's going to complicate our treatment and control comparison. Okay, so Sutpher violations, especially spillover violations, especially in urban areas, are problematic. And then the second thing is what happens when we roll out the policy at scale. Okay, the government might be like, sure, let me pilot it for 1 year, but I actually really care about what happens. Next year, I'm going to offer this to the city as a whole. Okay, urban economist says, okay, fine, no worries. I can answer. I can deal with the Sutpher. I can deal with the scale. I just need 5 elasticities. I want the migration elasticity, the elasticity of labor supply to earnings. I want the commuting elasticity to earnings. I want the housing supply income elasticity. I just need these 5 elasticities, like what we're talking about. Give me those elasticities and I will have the counterfactuals for you. But just what admin data do I have, government of Ethiopia, to estimate these elasticities? And then maybe what variation, what natural shocks have happened, or what identification strategies do I have? Okay, no admin data. How do we get these elasticities for this context? Development person. Okay, wonderful. I love your model, very intuitive. But in this context, 60% of people are self-employed and they're not working every day. What does it mean to have an average wage in the city? And also, did you know that people tend to take informal minibuses? They are not very regular. How do we understand commuting costs in that framework? Okay, so we do all of this. And these are sort of where we want to go to. Like, how do we think about the scarcity of data that might need someone on the ground? How do we think about getting the elasticities in a context where we can, even if we had the data to estimate the elasticity, what elasticity would we want to estimate and how does it map to this idea of informality? And then how do we think about all of the spillover effects? This paper does kind of, I would say, the first 2 bits of this. They don't really do this part. But what they do here, which is kind of super interesting, is they go and collect the data and they estimate the elasticities from a standard framework. And then they find that more than half of the effects of the program are actually coming indirectly rather than directly. So your treatment effect from treatment control understates the benefit of the policy by about half because it hasn't factored in the fact that people are doing things like dropping out of the labor market that's indirectly changing outcomes for other people. And they managed to track all that by commuting patterns across the city. However, the piece I think that would be the next step here is, okay, that's the standard framework. How much do those answers change if we really account for all of the informality that isn't there? So the first thing is, this is something that people care about. policymakers really care about understanding these questions. They're doing things like they're often really willing to randomize. They're often willing to trial out. We have the framework and the tools. And then how do we make those two things even better so that we're able to answer the questions even more accurately? Okay, so we sort of see this as both sides are bringing things to the table. And how do we kind of work through that? Okay, so we're going to just talk through a couple of the facts from modeling the frictions. And then if I have time, I'll talk about a little data exercise we do at the end, and then putting it all together, sort of where do we see the areas where there's high returns to working. Okay, so this is what we looked at before. We looked at indirect utility, something with an amenity term, something with an earnings term, something with a cost of living for housing term, maybe a P term, which is the price of goods, if you wanted to think about a trade model. And this would be the workhorse way that we would understand migration across cities, across regions, maybe even across neighborhoods. We might also have something like a commuting cost or a migration cost. This is sort of where you will start running into resistance when you present this stuff to applied economists. They will say like, okay, sure, but how do people, if they don't have cash on hand, how do they afford? So for example, in Dar es Salaam, when you move into a new house, you have to pay 6 months upfront rent. Okay, how do you get 6 months upfront to move into a new house, a room in a house? That's just how the housing market works here. How do you get that if you're credit constrained and you don't have any way to borrow money? Okay, what is that? If we have a missing market, maybe what's happening is people are not making choices. It's not a preference side, it's a constraint side. Where have we modeled? What are the constraints? Have we modeled them? Where are they there? Okay, heterogeneity. On average, this is what we're going to say is happening, but is it the case that everyone is paying the same wages? Everyone's paying the same rents? There's lots of work on, really exciting work in political economy, for example. Lots of this is focused on things like relationships across or within ethnic groups for things like landlord-tenant relationships. Are people getting access? In many communities, you don't always get access to the same amenities. Is everyone able to go to the same schools, use the same parks, do things like that? Is all of this stuff A? And that might be something cultural. It might also be sort of things like what Rebecca Diamond has in her paper, that the amenities might be endogenous to the income group. So you have a Whole Foods versus you have a Safeway. You know, the Whole Foods may not actually be an amenity that's valued by low income people. So how do we think about the heterogeneity there? And then coming back to this lack of data, what does it even mean to have a wage or have a cost of living? Where do we even get that information from? How would we even start to calibrate the model? Okay. And so again, what are we doing here? If we were wanting to answer any of these counterfactual questions, we would want a few elasticities. So, you know, what happens if cities are more productive? We would probably want to understand something about the elasticity of migration to wages, okay? If we had a nice identification strategy, we could trace that out, we could estimate that. But think of the data that you need for that. What is that data picking up? What sort of identification strategy? We might want to think about what happens to urban productivity when migrants arrive. This might be a story about agglomeration, it might be a story about congestion. We might want to think about something like elasticity of wages to labor, elasticity of productivity to population. Again, we can see the elasticity in the model, but how do we track that and map that to something empirical? How many people start working if there's a new transportation or a new metro line? We would want to know probably elasticity of labor supply, elasticity of commuting to changes in transportation cost. All those things are very easy to put into our framework. The piece where we want to think a little bit now is what do they map to in the real world? And I think this is relevant for doing work in the US, but it's going to be particularly relevant for places where some of the frictions might be different, okay? You know, and that might matter because if we're going to stick in our commuting elasticity from New York into Dar es Salaam, or let's say we stick it into migration from India, India has very different gendered labor supply patterns. For example, women are only working about 20% of the time. It may not be the right context to stick in our New York City commuting elasticity that's averaged across men and women into that context. So we might be estimating this wonderful counterfactual that doesn't actually have very much relevance to the context at hand. Okay, so let's go through amenities, wages, rents, talk a little bit about each of those, and then sort of circle back at the end. Okay, amenities. So one of the bread and butter explanations would be compensating differentials. Urban areas are really paying higher wages, therefore there's a cost, something that people don't like about being there. Maybe it's congestion, maybe it's pollution. And so once you take into account the amenity adjusted wage is going to be lower. You could maybe bundle in if you wanted to. Prices here, the prices will be a little bit different, okay? If it's the case that we would see that cities have both higher amenities and higher wages, then we might be wanting to go towards movement costs or some other friction that there's a reason that people don't move there. So this is going to be sort of important. How do we diagnose what the friction is? Let's think a little bit about some of these correlations. Okay, and here this is a table from Doug Gull and co-authors paper of just sort of, their paper used to be called something like, does the spatial model work for Africa? I think it's got a little bit of a different title now, but what are these correlations sort of when we look at data across different contexts, and does it look like there's a negative correlation or a positive correlation with amenities and wages? This is showing consumption, public goods, crime, and pollution by population density. So Q1 is lowest population density, Q4 is higher population density. And if you look essentially across all of these different outcomes, some of which are going to be standard amenities, some of them are kind of more like private goods. The sort of really interesting factor is that across the board, these things look higher in more dense locations. So private consumption, maybe that one's not surprising. People are richer. So we would think things like finished roof and child stunted. Those are lower, or people are doing better in more dense locations than less dense locations. Public goods, again, maybe there's some economies of scale. Providing public goods in an urban area might be cheaper. Maybe that makes sense. But again, across the board, there's more access to public goods, things like electricity grid, health clinic, in more dense locations than in less dense locations. The one that sometimes isn't there is things like, this is a negative amenity. And again, sometimes you're a little restricted by what data you have. Things like property crime, feeling unsafe is the only one that's going the opposite direction. There's a little more crime and safety issues in more dense locations. In this paper, they sort of go through how much must people dislike crime for that to be able to rationalize the migration patterns and the population patterns. And it just seems a little bit implausible that that could be the full thing that's driving it. Okay. In this particular context, in African cities, there's not actually higher pollution in cities, but sometimes there's more pollution. So that one might be a little context specific. Okay. So the first sort of compensating differential story doesn't seem to be a smoking gun here, that's going to be the thing to easily rationalize. Okay, thinking about labor market and wages. This one is really important because if we're thinking about productivity, we're thinking about income, what conceptually does that map to? In the paper, we go through, and for lots of things, we just plot. This LSS data is data that the World Bank collects across lots of urban and rural areas. So if you are looking for this LSMS, LSS data, that's a really good data source. It's not usually a panel, but it is something that gives really detailed consumption modules. And so if you're doing anything in this space and you want data across lots of countries, that's often a good place to start. Okay. So it's kind of hard to think about what wages or income would be. So there's lots of subsistence agriculture. So how do we measure the productivity effects of subsistence agriculture? It's also the case that when people are in suburban areas, they are often doing agriculture and they're not doing agriculture or. So what does that mean? It means that some of these patterns about people, structural change, moving out of locations, some of that is a little more complicated by the fact that people continue to do small scale agriculture, even if they're working in urban areas. Informal employment is super, super, super high. So informal employment means that people don't have regular jobs. What that translates into, what kind of job people are doing day to day is changing. It's also the case that how many days per week is also going to be quite variable. So even if say that you're employed, if you then ask, did you work last week? Usually about a half to 2/3 of people who say they're employed actually report working last week. Okay, so that's also something to think about both on the level and on the variance side. And then these are really interesting. This is a really interesting set of RCTs that are trying to even ask, if you have a labor supply shock in rural areas, do wages go up or wages go down? Okay, and a standard framework would be a labor supply shock would take away folks from a labor market, wages should go up. This paper does some really creative things where they randomize taking out like 50% of the workers from a village. And then they study what happens in the village labor market when 50% of the workers are employed somewhere else. And actually, it's quite sensitive to the time of the year. Is it a period of the year where there's a lot of work and things are a little more fluid and wages can adjust? Or is it a case where all of the adjustment happens on the employment margin and not the wage margin? Okay, and so even in this context of like our simple GE framework, it's not always the case that labor supply reductions, which would increase obviously productivity of people who are there, translates into wages. So that's just something about how do we model, if we put in this elasticity, is that the right way? Is that the right model of how to do it? Okay, what would we usually have in our baseline urban model? We would probably have one number that captures all this richness. What is the average wage? Okay, and then we would probably have some elasticity. Maybe we estimate it, maybe we take it at 0.7. What is the labor share in production? That would be the elasticity for how wages would change to an increase in labor in the city. Okay, so these two numbers are capturing a whole lot of richness. Okay, and what does that look like if we sort of look across the data? Ariana Bandiera and co-authors have this nice Jobs of the World database where they've taken all the LSMS data sets and they've sort of harmonized them all across outcomes and things like that. So you can look on aggregate how labor markets are different across the world. This is showing self-employment as a share of population. As on the x-axis, GDP per capita, and then on the y-axis, how many people are working on self-employed. So there's that sort of pattern that if we're looking at the US, it's probably fine to ignore that. By the time we're going to a middle income country, we want to start thinking about that. By the time we're in a low income country, we really want to start thinking about that. Okay, and then here are just some tabs from the Nigeria data. These are just to give you a sense of the magnitudes. These are sort of pretty standard sort of numbers you would get from running statistics across different data sets. So for example, what share of the adult population are in the labor force? That's not too different between urban and rural, 75, 78%. Once you drop folks who are only doing subsistence agriculture, in the rural area, you're about 60% of people who report being in the labor force, about 70% in the urban area. How many people are formally employed? Urban area, twice as much as rural area, but even only 20% in urban areas. Okay. How many people worked in the last 7 days? If you count agriculture, subsistence agriculture, 65%. So you can see 10 percentage points of people are not, say they're employed, but they're not actually working. Once you drop subsistence agriculture, 60% of people say that they worked in the last 7 days. Only 50% of people in rural areas say they worked in the last 7 days. And then looking at average incomes, you can see that total monthly earnings, here you have to be a little thoughtful about how you calculate that. Based on our best way of calculating it from the data, you can see it's about 20% higher in urban areas. So this sort of idea that there's just lots and lots of informal employment, and then people are moving in and out on a kind of daily basis of whether they're earning or not, is something that you have to think about. And then that might be something that's very idiosyncratic, or it might be something that generates a little more risk. How do we think about what's the right way to incorporate that idea into our work? Okay, commuting costs. Well, I don't think I need to talk too much about commuting costs. I could hand the floor over to Adam, but there's lots of work on whether or not commuting costs are different in low-income countries. Is that a measure of congestion? The roads are not great, or the infrastructure is not great. Is it, and so that would be an investment argument. Is it something about budgets? So in general, people spend about 12, 13% of their household income on commuting. That can be quite expensive. If you look at the data, often about 50% of people, especially lower income people in cities, are walking to work. If you look at low income countries. So even though commuting technology might exist, people may or may not actually be using it. That might be because they prefer to work close to home, or it might be because they're constrained and they don't have the income to take public transportation. Where does that map into our model? We have often this commuting cost. So we would have an elasticity of working outside the household or elasticity of travel time to work as a function of the distance to get there. That wouldn't usually have a constraint, like people need to have the cash up front to be able to pay for it. The second thing it might have an implication for is if we think about all of the reasons that living in a 15 million person city might be productive, all of those positive agglomeration spillovers. If it's the case that your radius that you're actually living in is your neighborhood within 30 minutes, that's a much smaller area of effective density. So again, when we're thinking about, is it the case that cities work the same way in low-income countries? If people are not moving around and is connected as much, then the density may not actually, the relationship between density and productivity may be different for that reason. Okay, so this is slightly older data, but we have a few more tabs. But for example, this was tabbing across 14 African cities. About 40% of trips for any purpose were walking. Next most common is minibus. So informal transit, that's normally private like minibuses that pull over on the side of the street, cause a lot of disruption. That's a lot of the reason why countries are trying to formalize and move into things like bus rapid transit or light rail. Motorcycles, maybe you are getting a ride on the back of a motorcycle, that's your commuting. Tends to be very few people are traveling by private car. And formal things like buses are often quite a small share of the public transportation. Okay. This is some of the data from our survey, that data that we collected in Dar es Salaam. Low and high here is just below or above median consumption. And so what we see is that expenditure shares on transit at the household level are about 15%. That's pretty high, although not totally different. I think in the US, it's around 10, 11, something like that. It's not too different on average. What you can see, so green is poorer households, orange is richer households, about the same share of people are working, but poorer households are much more likely to commute by foot. Okay. Although richer households are also commuting by foot. But you can see that there's many more poorer households who are commuting by foot. That obviously means that where you live is going to be a little more related to what kind of jobs you have, even if you're in a city that's really dynamic and there's lots of possibilities. And then very, very few people are commuting by car. In this context, car ownership is just very, very low. Although interestingly, when you think about some of the more macro effects, as we get richer, what's going to happen? Things like congestion. At the moment, congestion is often a challenge, even though very few people have private cars. One of the goals of the government of Tanzania when they were building this bus rapid transit was trying to make the bus rapid transit nice enough so that it would induce the well-off people who would otherwise be driving to take the public transportation. That ran into a few political economy issues because they wanted to set the price pretty high so that they could like have it uncrowded and have air conditioning. That kind of ran into political economy issues because it was set too high for the average household to use. They ended up lowering the price, then the quality of the transportation. The very first time I rode it, it had air conditioning. Every other time it's had windows are open, super crowded. I don't think the air conditioning lasted very long. And if you're somebody who has an option of a nice air conditioned car, you may not therefore be willing to substitute. So this idea of like modal shift, both now and then as we think about countries getting richer, is also something that's going to interact. Okay, for the housing market, so where do people live? This was also something really interesting and I think very context specific. In Dar es Salaam, we did a lot of work trying to understand the housing market. We had been piloting spatial subsidies to move people across space into different neighborhoods. And there were really interesting things. Like for example, the 6 months upfront rent that you have to pay. All of the rental contracts, the modal rental contract there is every 6 months, you pay 6 more months. And to move into a house the first time, houses in this setting are rooms inside a bigger family house. So you like one household there might be 2 or 3 households living per structure, and each family has a room and then they share the kitchen. But in this context, the fee to move in, if you had a realtor sort of helping, an informal person helping you, would be a month of the rent to move in. Then you would be paying 6 months upfront, and then every 6 months you would pay another 6 months upfront. So that's just a different set of rental contracts. Some countries have 2-year you need to pay 2 years upfront. You can just think about some of these being quite large frictions for people who might be coming from rural areas, for example, moving in. That's a really substantial amount of money to have upfront. It's also the case, there's lots of informal housing. So what does informal housing mean? If the definition of a slum is usually about the quality of the house, it doesn't necessarily tie to property rights, although it can be correlated with having low property rights. But the UN definition of slums is to do with the quality of the materials inside the house. So the majority of people are living in low quality housing. Over time, this has been something that many countries have experienced. There's lots of really interesting historical work that's looking at longer term spillover effects of slum redevelopment, cities and effects on city development. There are a couple of references. All the references, by the way, are at the end of the slides and also in the handbook chapter. There's also some really interesting non-homotheticity to think about. So I guess if you had to think about it, would low-income people have a higher share of their income on housing or a lower share of their income on housing? Maybe talk in your group for 2 seconds. Talk in your group and see what people think. Higher, lower-income people, I guess think about it in 2 settings. Lower-income people in the US, do you expect them to have higher share or lower share of income? And then lower-income people, let's say Tanzania, because that's a number I know, do you expect them to have lower or higher? And if there's a difference, why would there be a difference? I sort of set it up for you a little bit. So
Yeah, that is true.
Because of the way she said that. Yeah.
just eavesdropping.
I think in the US, saying it's a share. There's not
That's actually interesting. I haven't, on average, we don't see that in our tab, so that's an interesting, yeah, let's talk about that one. Come back. But what,
I guess here we're curious.
yeah. Yeah, it could be.
This is exactly something that I'm.
Okay, so I think as with anything, there's lots of like really interesting wrinkles. So on average, what did we think about housing shares? And I can tell you what's consistent with our tabs. And then I think there's some really interesting heterogeneity in this as well. So on average, let's just say on average in the US, what would we normally expect about, and then maybe what would be what we would think about a country like Tanzania?
US lower income.
Okay. So on average, we find that in our tabs when we cross tab, but there is some wrinkle of like whether or not, do you want to?
Yeah, so there's like two, so all the macro people assume Cobb Douglas because actually people get the CX, like so their share is much flatter for income group than you think it is. That's because high income people sort into richer places. And so even though there's non-homothetic preferences, high people live where rent is higher, so their expenditure shares get pushed out as well.
Yeah, so when we tab it across, when we tab like CS data, we find on average in the US and this way, but I think there's some other work which might show that it's on things are changing. So in general, let's say on average, people would tend to think about in the US, poorer people spend a higher share of income on housing with a wrinkle that if people are moving into more expensive neighborhoods, that may not go. Who has a guess of what might happen in Tanzania? And I guess since I asked you, it's obviously the opposite. who might have a sense of what might be going on there? Yeah.
So housing is a necessity, which means that so in the US you have this relationship, but food is also a necessity, and food is even more a necessity than housing, but it might reverse really.
Yeah, exactly. So what share? Well, here, let me show you the tab. Okay, share of consumption on food. 55%, this is from Nigeria, 55% if you're in an urban area, 65% if you're a rural area. Okay, so Actually, I don't know off the top of my head. I don't remember the share of house income on food in the US. It's
9%.
huh?
It's 9%.
9%. Okay, there we are. So what does that mean? It means in general, when we think about, if you talk to a development person about non-homotheticities, the main thing they're thinking about is food. There's just an adding up constraint. If you're spending 60% of your household income on food, there's just not much left over for income, for housing. And so some of these patterns are going to factor in on what else is happening. So I think, again, there's not a problem with putting in non-homotheticities into the model. But if you made an assumption that this non-homotheticity was going to be more like a larger share for lower income or higher income, or even for the US, you might want to make sure that you're validating that and then thinking through. And it's interesting because if you're trying to think, for example, about who might be more exposed to an increase in housing prices, it's quite difficult if low income households are spending a lower share than rich households. Proportionally, higher income households could be more exposed to increases in housing prices, which is kind of opposite, sometimes the opposite intuition we might have for things like gentrification. And so again, it's just sort of something to think through about context. Okay. It's also the case that it's really hard to get measures of income, housing costs for many low income countries. There's not often transaction data for sales, and it's hard to get information on rents. People often pay rents, but they don't always pay market rents. And in general, of course, there's differences between urban and rural areas. Okay. So all of this, if we just had that average rent in our model, is going to kind of, again, is hiding quite a lot of the richness that might be actually happening. You can put in non-homotheticity. This is Nick's job market paper. Here he puts a non-homotheticity where lower income households have more exposed to housing prices. When we actually did the data, it looks like Colombia is one country where it kind of switched. Colombia is a middle income country. It switches over there. People are spending a lower share of, poor people are spending a lower share of income on their groceries. Once you're into a lot of countries like Tanzania and Kenya, people are spending sort of 50-ish% of their income on food. It just doesn't leave much else for scope. Okay. Again, here is just sort of percentages across the world. 25% of the world lives in housing that is measured as substandard. That's the UN definition. The UN definition for slums has got certain components. But you can see, we talked about massive urbanization rates in Africa. 54% of the population are living in inadequate housing. Okay, so as cities grow, what does that mean for how cities are organized? What does that mean for things like urban services? All of these sorts of demons of density are going to be really important, especially when people have got maybe substandard housing, which may have implications in both how the city is organized, how people live, how people make investments, how families work, and kids are able with health and education. Okay, this is just our tab from the Nigerian data. In general, 5 people per household. That's about average. Lots of the demographic transition is hitting really quickly now in most of Africa. So something like 60% of the projected population increases are what they call momentum increases. So what happens, that just means that right now there's a larger cohort of women of childbearing age because there was population growth in the past. So even if those women only have 2.1 children each, that's going to get you 60% of the way to what the projected population increases are. So the scope for policy about demographic changes is quite small because most countries are already reducing, people are already having fewer children on average, and that's going down really quickly. So in general, this is Nigerian data. For example, 5 people per household, that's about average. It's not the case that people are still having massive households. So as we think about demographic changes, that's coming down really, really quickly. 40% of urban areas are in a slum, 77% of rural. Normally we don't think about slums and rural, but this is using the slum definition of quality of house and just using the data that we have for the rural households. There's a big difference between whether you own your residence, if you're urban versus rural, so 30% versus 70%. People do ask about what would this portion of your house cost if you were to buy it or pay for it or rent it. And so that's the data that we have. But it is tricky because those market-based transactions are not often very common. And in this context, what you can see is that, again, 55% of household consumption is on food in urban areas. Doesn't leave much extra. So there's about 7% on rent in urban areas and 5% on rent or housing costs in rural areas. Okay, so those were the markets. So if we think about wages, amenities, rents, those are kind of the core ingredients for spatial equilibrium. And so what did we see? We saw hard to find evidence of compensating differentials. Wages are higher, but there's a lot of complications with informality. Rents are on average higher in urban areas, but again, there's lots of informality there on rents. So if we're coming back to the last sort of key standard explanation, it would be something about migration costs. People are not moving to urban areas because there are big frictions that stop them from moving. Okay. And so here, what we're going to do is an exercise that is going to look at how people flow across space. And we're going to ask what frictions, what costs are consistent with that. But this is not going to be super clean because anything we observe has to be a combination of choices and constraints. So we're going to back out, if we thought about wedges that were bilateral, what would it look like to have a migration cost between one location and another location? But it could be the case that what we're picking up is actually credit constraints and not physical distance costs. We're going to show that it correlates with distance. But again, if people don't have the money to catch the bus, it may not be that building another road is going to solve the problem because people might not still have the money. And so again, mapping from how would you change behavior to whatever policy needs to make sure you understand clearly if people are choosing not to go because it takes 6 hours versus they don't have the money, but they would go if they had the money. Okay. So we'll do this exercise, but this exercise can't sort of separate out these two. And I think those two are really important for thinking about policy implications. Okay. But in saying that, let's just ask and see if it looks like people are less mobile across distance as a function of how rich the country is.
People also have this outside option in some developing countries of moving to another country and kind of sending back remittances, or kind of there is this outside option. Is that, I don't have a good sense of like, I know that in some countries remittances are a really important part of like economic flows, but do people ever model this, or do we just kind of assume this is all going on domestically?
Yeah, you can model that. It's really small, the share of people that move externally. So usually it's not modeled. And the other thing that's tricky is a lot more people probably would want to move than are able to. And so often that one is one where there's quite a strong like legal constraint or migration costs. So most frameworks don't do that, but I think there would be a case for, if you're looking, for example, at a very common migration channel, maybe you're wanting to look at the impact of productivity shocks in Mexico on migration to the US, that might, or vice versa, impacts of housing crises in the US on migration back to Mexico. That might be one where it makes sense to actually think about the outside option because that's a relatively large corridor. In West Africa, there's free mobility among certain countries. So you can think about that a little bit. And I think that's really interesting. One challenge would be how there's very few data sets that track people across national borders. The Mexican Family Life Survey is one. So there's the Indonesia Family Life Survey. These are really like long-running panel surveys. The Indonesia Family Life Survey tracks people across different locations in Indonesia. The Mexican Family Life Survey actually tries to find them if migrants move across the border, and they try and survey the migrant in the US as well as the household back at home. However, the sample size is not massive, but that's one that you could potentially track people over time. Yeah. Okay, so this exercise, what we're going to do is the head race index. This is just, this is a very common thing that folks use in international trade. Basically, if you remember what we had as the migration probability, migration goes from O to D as a function of the common stuff in D divided by the migration friction. All you do is you just take a ratio of what is migration from O to D divided by migration from D to O. So that, and then you normalize by how many people don't migrate at all. So the idea is if you're not migrating, that tells you something about how good that location is. You look at the flows from O to D and the flows back from D to O. That's giving you a way to back out what the friction is that's consistent with those patterns of migration. So the cost is this ratio, and then it's a function also of our friend, the migration elasticity, which is coming from the extreme value distribution. Okay, we're gonna get that COD thing, and then we just want to correlate it with distance, and then we want to just correlate that with GDP. Okay. So is it relatively more costly? Do people make choices that are consistent with it being more costly to travel across more distance in low-income countries relative to higher-income countries? That's one of the exercises we did in our paper in looking at allocation of folks in Indonesia, and then we sort of showed that this elasticity is steeper in Indonesia than the US, which might be consistent with, for example, lower quality infrastructure. For this, we just pull all of the data on that we can measure from IPUMS that has migration for sub-Saharan Africa. Migration in IPUMS tends to be about country, like origin of what sub-state were you born in versus where are you living now. So when you're thinking about where people are moving, sometimes there's lots of reasons I think referencing relative to where you're born makes sense. People tend to only move, most people, if they move once, and if they move twice, they come back to where they started from. So most of us in this room are very atypical migrants and that we've probably moved around a bunch. So I think it doesn't usually matter too much if you're thinking about migration in the last 5 years versus where you're born. But it's much more common that you're going to get migration by region of birth. Okay. So we do that exercise, and then what we're doing is we're taking that implied cost, and then we're just correlating it against distance, and then that's what we're plotting here. So what we see is that, for example, countries that are richer, it looks like people are much less sensitive to moving across longer distances than in countries that have lower GDP per capita. Okay, so that's one sense that it could, part of these frictions could be the case as, like this is for example, higher improvements in infrastructure might make it easier to travel across distance. That could be part of the reason that people are not moving. Although again, there's lots of things bundled in here. It could also be that people in the US, the financial friction is not too the constraint. That would then have to correlate with distance though to get back to this pattern.
If you put in land area, it just occurs, I mean, like it makes a lot of sense to me that income would matter here, but it does also strike me that like that bigger countries are on the right as well. I also see like Sierra Leone.
Yeah, we did. I don't think we did that. We could do that. That would be interesting. We did drop, for example, in South Africa, there were only 4 sub-regions. So we did drop South Africa. Most of these are at the level of something like this. So in the US, it's at the level of the state. Yeah, that would be something interesting. So like on average, are we getting
15 data points?
Yeah.
It would just strike to me that, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe it's just unfortunate that the rich countries you have are also enormous, right? So
I don't actually know if on average states are small. I mean, the US.
Oh, I meant like the size of the country as a whole. Like if like the large countries invest more in like London because you're doing less with respect to distance. So that was why it's just striking to me that it's like because even Chile, like, you know, it's kind of long.
Well, you could also then think a little bit about the shape. You could think about the shape of it as well, right? Like it's exactly. Yeah, so like it's more like you get
like in that's the land area might not be right.
Yeah.
Like distances between, you know, some sort of distance metric.
You could think of it like Nina's job market paper where she's looking at the city shape and thinking about what that might imply for as an amenity, because partly it's easier to get around if you have a more well-behaved shape. You could think about something like that for this. Like here we're doing centroid to centroid average, centroid to centroid state level pair. So it's pretty crude, although it's kind of the data that you can do. Yeah. Okay. And then all of this, if it is the case that the frictions are important because again, you know, we're thinking about efficient allocation of people. If it's a friction suggests a policy response. If we can understand what the right policy response is, that can be a response to the potential misallocation. But it brings us all back, and we have a big discussion here in the paper. If we do see migration costs, you know, there's lots of different explanations. Is it credit constraints? Is it infrastructure? Is it frictions in the land market? Is it risk? Is it information? Is it urban bias? All of these are kind of policy and very context specific. So again, this would be like the default explanation, but we'd want to dig a little bit more so we can understand what's going on. Maybe give me, since I have 2 minutes, let me wrap up and then happy to sort of chat afterwards. Okay, so concluding thoughts. I think, first of all, if we care about welfare of the world's poor, thinking about how to understand if people are in the most productive location where everyone has their labor that they can choose to use. Is their labor are they getting the highest return that they could from their labor? Are they able to work in the place that gives them that highest return? if they can't move across country borders, are they at least able to earn what the maximum is and choose to locate themselves in the place that gives them the highest utility inside their own country? So I think this is a really important question, both for thinking about poverty, thinking about how we understand urbanization, thinking about how countries are going to grow. Whatever angle you want to come at it, I think understanding the patterns of movement and patterns of how cities work in low-income countries is going to be increasingly important, both for everyone in this room, the urban folks, and for the development folks. In the paper, we sort of talk through here all of the assumptions. Here is like the default assumption for each of these markets. But what does that actually look like if we were going to map that to the context where there's many informal or missing markets? And we don't know if that would change some of the policy recommendations of the urban framework. And I think that's a really interesting area for work where it's not, there's lots and lots of ways to think about modeling more carefully informality. How does that circle back? If you're working in a context where informal markets are important, what's the best way to capture that? How does that change the elasticities? Quantitatively, what different answers do you get if you have an elasticity that's adjusted for informality versus not? And we sort of argue that there's 3 areas where we think there could be lots of returns to doing work. The first is, how do we put these market imperfections? There's informality, there's duality. How do we put those into models? Does it change any of our elasticities? Second is, what is the way that we can get cleaner identification of lots of these elasticities in a context-specific way? So some of that, I think, could be running and going and doing lots of, it's pretty easy to get migration, commuting elasticities to migration, travel costs. That just involves subsidizing people to take different types of transportation. There's no reason that if you're using a model that needs that parameter, you can't just go and run a little experiment to get the parameter for your context. It's not a big amount of work. It would give you that number kind of immediately, rather than plugging in that elasticity from a different context. For other stuff, it might be that, you know, this is what we should be looking through all of the replication files that are online for all of the journals, where there's probably lots of inputs that let us estimate some of these elasticities that may not have actually been the focus of what those papers were doing in the first place, but might give us some sense of what would be the right housing elasticity, for example. Do we have anything that lets us get at that? So that at least if we're running our models, we've got context-specific elasticities that we can feel a little bit more comfortable, or we could do at least robustness over those. And then the third one, which kind of comes back to some of the discussion, is what, let's say it's unfeasible to go and collect data. It's very expensive. It takes a lot of time. Development funding has just been decimated. So I don't know how many really big surveys grad students are going to be able to get to do. What are the ways that we can use the data that might be, you know, remote sensing, cell phone data, Google Maps, all of these new things? I think that's a really exciting avenue. What can we learn from different data sorts? So it's what ways that we can map all that. Can we do sort of development economics, urban economics from space? How do we think about that as, and if we do need to go and collect data on the ground, what are sort of the high value pieces that we need to fill in this? So I think that's what I wanted to talk through today. But again, we've got all of this written up in the handbook chapter. There's lots and lots of references here. So if any of this stuff is interesting, take a look at that. And I'm always happy to chat through ideas, whether it's urban with some of these ideas in the US, or it's thinking about how we integrate this across space. I think these are really, really important and policy relevant questions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Melanie. I have just a couple of, first of all, just shameless